My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, and I have to say, I feel a bit like a John Lennon without his Paul McCartney. Or should it be the other way around? Who was Paul and who was John in the duo between Rob and me? Jeez. This is the kind of question that Rob and I would have debated if he were here. Well, as you probably guessed, Rob is not going to make it to this episode, but no worries. He will be back, I guarantee it. Rob is busy finishing his translation of Wang Anshi, and he's also beginning training in France to become a professor of English literature at a lycée, the French equivalent of a high school. And I'm sure he already has been issued his beret and his baguette, and you and I are just going to have to soldier on, Robless. Let me explain what I'm thinking of doing. This week's episode, along with next week's episode, I will be doing it solo. This week, we're going to look at a poem by Wang Anshi, a poet and politician from the Song dynasty that Mao really liked. Rob and I did an episode or two on his poetry during our accidental Song dynasty series. The next episode, which will come out in 2 weeks, we're still doing that 2-week thing again, I will be doing the podcast again. This time it will be a poem on Mao that actually quotes a line from today's poem. So I guess that kind of makes this like a mini-series, just involving 2 poems that are kind of related. But I promise you, in 4 weeks, Rob is going to be back. Jeez, a month without Rob, it's just finally hitting me. That's like a season without sunshine. Well, we don't really have much of a choice, and as y'all know, I'm based in Oregon, so I'm kind of used to 2 or 3 months without seeing the sun. It's rough, but really, we don't have much of a choice. 没有办法, right? That's enough of explanation. Let's turn to this week's poem. This week, I am going to look at a poem that was written by Wang Anshi in 1052. This poem is written as Wang Anshi is just a minor, obscure official somewhere in the Jiangnan, the Yangtze River Delta. He's working as an assistant prefecture magistrate in what is today Qianshan County in modern Anhui. Now, in 1069, Wang Anshi is going to become a big deal. He's going to take over the bureaucracy. He's going to become the head honcho. But when this poem's written, he's only 32 years old. And the poem is written as he is visiting the graves of his father and older brothers, or shortly thereafter. His brother died the year before in 1051. His father, who had been working nearby, died more than a decade before in 1039, I think. The poem is called Ren Chen Han Shi. Ren Chen is just the number 29 in the 60-year cycle that has been going on in Chinese history for pretty much as long as China has had history. As long as events in China have been written down, they have had the 60-year cycle. Ren Chen is just the way to refer to the number 29 in the 60-year cycle. These things pop up occasionally when you're looking at Chinese history. If you go back, the 1911 revolution that ended the Qing dynasty is known in Chinese as the Xinhai Geming, the Xinhai Revolution. That's because 1911 was the 48th year of the 60-year cycle, and Xinhai is just the number 48 in the cycle. The Sino-Japanese War that began in 1894, in Chinese, we call that Jiawu Zhanzheng. That's because it's the 31st year of that 60-year cycle, and Jiawu is just the way to refer to 31. So Ren Chen, again, just means this is happening in the year 1052, the 29th year of that 60-year cycle. Han Shi, this literally means something like cold food or cold eating. It refers to a practice, festival, I'm not actually sure, that happened just before Tomb Sweeping Festival. Han Shi means that you don't eat cooked food. It's a way to honor the ancestors. Normally, I think this happened the day before Qingmingjie, but I think it varies from place to place. Okay, now let's get into the meat of this episode, that is, my translation of the poem. The traveler's thoughts are like poplars and willows. The spring wind blows through a billion branches. Especially as tomb sweeping day approaches, the tears overflow like the tides of Yeville. I brush the snow off my turban and hair. In the mirror, my face is red and starting to wither. I still do not know what makes the fancy officials happy. I only want to grow old as a recluse. That's it. Just 8 lines, or sort of 4 or 8 lines in the original Chinese, depending on how you define a line. As normal, I'll put the translation along with the original on the website, but that's the full poem right there. Let's get into what this poem is about. First off, this poem expresses how much Wang Anshi misses his father and brothers. It's meant to be sad, and I think it is pretty sad. It also signifies Wang Anshi's going to actually take care of their final affairs and going to sweep off their grave for grave sweeping festival. At the end, Wang Anshi, seemingly lost in despair, resigns himself to living as a recluse and turning his back on life as a worldly official. Of course, we know that he's not actually going to do that, but that's what the poem suggests is he's kind of thinking about in 1052, just kind of giving it all up. Let me break it down for you line by line. So in those first 2 lines, the traveler's thoughts are like poplars and willows. The spring wind blows through a billion branches. Here, Wang Anshi feels lost in his thoughts. There is this labyrinth of contemplation that leads him into despair. He's just overcome by so many branches of thinking that he cannot find his way through. There's an almost Dante-esque quality to this poem right here, where he's just lost in the middle of his life. He doesn't know what to do. His thoughts seem like tree branches just kind of closing in on him. In that 3rd and 4th line, he actually goes to where his father and brother are. So I translated the place, the city in this poem as Yeville. The town is called in Chinese Yecheng. So I'm being a little bit cheeky in translating that as Yeville, but I think it kind of works. I don't actually know. I wasn't able to find that much about the tides, but there are several places in China that are quite famous for their tides. Wang Anshi would have almost certainly been very familiar with these tides. There are some in Hangzhou that actually, some people have suggested the first surfers actually surfed here. That is, Chinese folks have suggested that it wasn't Hawaiians who invented surfing, but it was Chinese folks in Hangzhou surfing on these giant seasonal tides that invented surfing. I don't know if I buy that, but I have heard that claim. Back to the poem. As Wang Anshi goes to sweep off the graves of his father and brothers, he's overcome by tears. This is late winter. There's still snow on his hat, or I guess it's really a turban. It's just something wrapped around his head, protecting him from the cold. He mentions how difficult this is on him. He says he looks at himself in the mirror and he notices not only how the cold has made his face red, but also that he looks like he's starting to wither and grow old. Keep in mind, Wang Anshi is only 32 when he writes this poem, so he's no geriatric. But I don't know about y'all, but when I was around 25 or 30, I began to notice the very first signs of aging. It was around that time I started noticing injuries took a little bit longer to heal. In the shower, I noticed that hot water hitting my head started hurting when the water was too hot, and I reached up on the top of my crown and realized that the hair up there was not as thick as it used to be. So when I read this poem, this line really spoke to me. You've got Wang Anshi looking at the monuments to his dead family. He's realizing that he is no spring chicken. His family's dead, and he's facing his own mortality right here. Now, those final 2 lines, that is where we witness his thoughts go after he senses that he is prematurely aging. He says he does not want to live the life of an official or an elite member of society. He rejects the normative notions of happiness. That is, everybody in society says the thing that you have to do is become an official. It's kind of like a 9-to-5 job, 6-figure, that sort of thing in the American discourse. I think most modern societies have a similar discussion of like, this is the thing that you absolutely have to do. This is the goal that everyone should have. They should go to college. They should get a good paying job. They should get married, have 2.2 children, a white picket fence, 2 cars, and a dog. In Song Dynasty China, the equivalent to that was becoming an official. That was the thing. Wang Anshi is an official. He's a nobody, but he actually, I didn't mention this at the beginning of the podcast, he actually scored quite high on the exams. And he could have gotten a fairly high job, but he decided to turn it down to be in a small rural area closer to his family. And now some of those family members are dead, and he is struggling with what he wants to do. And he says, you know what? I don't know that I really want to be an official. The word that he actually uses here, in some earlier translations, I translated it as fancy cars rather than fancy officials. The reason for that is because the word Wang Anshi uses is xuan mian. It refers to carriages and clothes that high officials wear. So xuan was a kind of carriage. Mian was refers to the crown, though here I don't think it suggests royalty. It just suggests the kind of garments and accoutrements that officials wore. These two things, when combined, the carriage and the crown, they became symbols of the bling that you would get from being a high official. So here, what Wang Anshi is doing is he's turning his back on the bling that you're supposed to want in life. He has succeeded at the rat race. He's obtained the goal that everyone in the Song society wanted, that is becoming an official. And he says, nah, it's not worth it. I don't know why those officials, with all their bling, are happy, is what Wang Anshi is saying. So you can see this is a pretty powerful line. Okay, let's turn to the last line. I translated that last line as, I only want to grow old as a recluse. But it literally says something like, I only want to grow old becoming a fisherman and woodcutter. The fisherman and the woodcutter, these two characters combine to refer to a recluse, the old man who Thoreau-like, that's David Henry Thoreau, goes off into the woods and just lives off fish that he can catch and the wood that he can chop down. These recluses are the opposite of the official. In this moment of desperation, when Wang Anshi is confronting the loss of his father and brothers and his own mortality, what he wants to do is become a recluse. So that's kind of the standard way to understand this poem. There is another reading of this poem, though I'm hesitant to go too deep into it. I mentioned that Wang Anshi became the head honcho of the Song dynasty eventually in 1069. And Wang Anshi, as he is writing this in 1052, he's trying to institute some of the economic policies in his local district that are going to make him famous and eventually catapult him to that high position in the Song bureaucracy. These economic policies are going to become very controversial, and they're going to spark the partisan bickering that eventually tears the Song dynasty apart. And I mean that literally. After Wang Anshi, the Song dynasty is going to lose its northern half, and it's going to be called the Southern Song dynasty. Some people blame Wang Anshi for this loss, but that's all in the future. In 1052, Wang Anshi is experimenting with some of those policies. He's trying to institute these policies on a local level, and he's facing a good deal of pushback, apparently, from people who do not like his policies. One way I think you can think about this poem is he's wandering, lost in despair at the resistance of these policies that he thinks will help out the people, but that the entrenched powers that be are resisting. He's looking at his failure so far and he's going, maybe I ought to just turn back on this career. Maybe I ought to give up on being an official and just become a recluse. Now, that's one way I think you can read this poem. I'm a little hesitant to read it that way. Why? Because Wang Anshi is writing in 1052, and these policies are going to become super controversial in 1069. That's more than a decade and a half down the road. Some scholars, I think, have a tendency to read the poem written in 1052 in light of the 1069 controversy. And As anyone who has, aged will be able to tell you, things that you thought when you were 32 might not really express what you were thinking by the time you were 49 years old. Heck, I'm only 38, and I look back at things I said and did last year and marvel at how idiotic I was and how little I knew. What's that line from Socrates? Something about recognizing your ignorance as being the only kind of wisdom. Anyways, I've rambled on long enough about this poem, and without Rob to enliven my conversations, I don't want to bore y'all too much. So the next episode is going to come out in 2 weeks. That one will just be me again, and I'll look at a poem by Mao that cribs off this Wang Anshi poem. If your lack of the Chinese Literature Podcast is making your thoughts wander and feel like you're lost in a billion poplar and willow branches, then check out our website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Look us up on Twitter at ChinLitPod. We try and post a couple of times a week there, mostly news of the podcast or something this day in China's literary history, that kind of thing. If you think I did a good or a terrible job with this solo episode, I'd like to know. Send us an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you want to show some love to the podcast, a great way to do it is by becoming a Patreon patron. Find the Chinese Literature Podcast on Patreon. This is Lee Moore saying, 爱别离苦, parting is so bitter.